Welcome, everyone. This is a special select board meeting on May 5th at 6:30. I find that as chair of the Norwich Select Board, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by Governor Scott as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and pursuant to Addendum 6 to Executive Order 0120 and Act 92, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. In accordance with Act 92, there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting. However, in accordance with the temporary amendments to the open meeting law, I confirm that we have provided public access to this meeting by Zoom and that we also have a means to dial in through telephone. Members of the board have the ability to communicate contemporaneously during this meeting through this platform, the Zoom platform, and the public has access to contemporaneously listen and, if desired, participate in this meeting by raising your hand at the bottom of the Zoom application, or else pressing *9 and then, when instructed to, press *6 to speak. I can also confirm that we have provided a phone number for emergency access if people are unable to access this meeting. And I believe that is it. We will have roll call if it is not unanimous. Okay, with that said, this is once again a special meeting, which means that correspondence and some of our other agenda items like correspondence and the consent agenda are not a part of this meeting, but as per our last regular meeting, we had a motion to bring what you see on this agenda forward. So the first order of business, and I should also announce that Claudette Brochu won't be joining us this evening. Something came up for her last minute, but she told us to press on, and we have a quorum. With all that said, the first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda.
I move to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Great. And then any discussion? If I can, a friendly amendment, I would like to, if depending on where we are, if we could add a discussion of our next meeting agenda to the end of this meeting, because we've had a tight turnaround. So we'll touch base on some future agenda items for our next regular schedule meeting, if that's okay.
I am willing to do that.
Okay.
It's not, it is actually on our motions next to meeting agenda items, but we often sort of don't get around to that. I think that's very wise,
Okay.
personally.
So is there a second to that amendment?
Second.
Great. Great. So all in favor of voting approval of the agenda with the amendment that I mentioned to add on future agenda items? All in favor? That was clunky. Yes, great. Okay, so the next item is public comment for items that are not on the agenda. Go ahead, Deborah Hannum.
Hi, I just want to, I know it's not on the agenda, but I just want to weigh in on this policing thing, please. I was quoted my full name in the Valley News last Friday, which I actually was very upset about because I feel it put me at risk, but it's been done. And I have seen in the listserv that there have been a number of people weighing in support of having a fully staffed police force in town. And I just want to ask that the select board please pay attention to that and think hard about it. Think hard about public safety. As it turns out yesterday, something that was stolen from my house last August has turned up in the Haverhill, New Hampshire Police Department. They contacted me. A wallet that was stolen was found by the side of the road. And there's not really anybody in Norwich that has the capacity to follow up on it. We cannot be safe in this town with a police force of 3 people. I don't care what you call it, who you call a chief, it's not about what you call them. We need to have at least 4 officers serving us for public safety purposes. And I know a lot of other people, I had a lot of people contacting me since this article in the Valley News came out. And I don't like to attract attention. I hate it. But this is so important. Okay, I was the victim of a really violent burglary. The Valley News article said attempted burglary. It was not attempted. And in the 25 minutes it took the police to get to my house was ransacked. Okay, my son and his girlfriend, 25 years old, were in the house. Okay, maybe this doesn't happen every day in Norwich, but it happened. And there's no progress on the investigation because there's no one to investigate because we don't have a full police force. And these people, they're not caught. They're not going to come back to me, but they could go to someone else. And if they know that Norwich doesn't have a full complement of police officers, they're going to go and do someone else because we're a soft target. So please, please, I'm begging you, think hard about this, okay? I don't care if you hire a chief or not. Just think hard about what the correct amount of staff is for the Norwich Police Department. Okay?
Thanks so much for your public comment.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comments for items not on the agenda? This is a special meeting, and I imagine we may talk about for follow up at our next of the issue that was just spoken to at our next regularly scheduled meeting. Okay. Any select board comments, or can we move on to our agenda?
I'd like to move on.
Marcia, did you like to make a select board comment?
Just a quick comment. I'd like to see that go on the next agenda.
What is
I
that?
think Deb I think we have to follow up.
Right. We'll be following up on the action that we voted on at our last meeting. Yep.
So does that mean that it's a fait accompli and that we're going to have to live with 3 police officers for the next year?
I really appreciate your public comment, but I always try to be consistent, and I know that this is particularly important, but we take public comments, we say thank you, and then if it's important and it needs to be an agenda item, we address it and at our next meeting. So that's just the procedure of the meetings, and so we'll be continuing our conversation about this at our next.
But I just asked if the select board voted last week, and does that vote is that whole? Is that the end of it? And is that, I mean, maybe it's Herb I have to ask, since he's the one who said that's what he's going to do. It wasn't presented as a proposal. It was presented as, this is what I'm going to do. And so if that is indeed what you are going to do, I would like to know. And if it's something that you are going to reconsider doing, I would also like to know that.
So I can tell you that I can say that at our last meeting on April 28th, the board voted to approve the town manager's recommendation. That is the public.
I know, I was there.
Yeah. But yeah.
And there's no way that approval would be reversed.
Again, that's a future agenda item. I don't necessarily see that. But yes.
So basically, you're telling me that this town will not have more than 3 police officers for the foreseeable future.
I'm telling you that there'll be a future agenda item to discuss the process going forward.
You just told me the decision was taken.
I'm telling you what has been captured in our public meeting notes. I'm sorry. I need to. Herb Durfee has his hand up, so he will make a comment, and then I would like to move on with truly all due respect.
So just in terms of procedure, parliamentary type of procedure, the board could if you're going to talk about policing at your next meeting, you could have a motion for reconsideration or from that standpoint where you might change your position from that standpoint. That's perfectly acceptable under parliamentary procedure. as it pertains to, I think that for right now, the action was taken by the board. You're proceeding forward in the interim solution that was put out there. And again, this coming up at your next week's meeting, I think that it is permissible to, if there is a board member that wishes to offer that as you know, I can't remember if it's reconsideration or the, I'm drawing a blank on the other parliamentary word, but anyway, it's a form of reconsideration of a vote that was already taken. That's permissible under parliamentary procedure. So there is that opportunity to just try to help clarify for tonight's discussion and to try to give a little bit more direct answer to Deborah on that.
Thank you, Herb.
Thank you, Herb. Yeah, I thank you as well. That is more helpful than my answer. So, but in the same spirit nonetheless, but thank you. Can we move on? This is not an agenda item. Go ahead, Mary.
It could be though. So when we are talking about next week's agenda, I think we should talk about it. So just saying.
Sure, there is an agenda item to discuss future agenda items, but there is not an agenda
When we
item
get-
to discuss.
When we get down there, I would be interested in talking about this.
Sure.
Okay.
Second.
Well, we haven't moved anything. It's just, I think, Marcia, you're also interested in
Yeah.
possibly having this as an agenda item for the
I'm
next
seconding
meeting.
the notion. I'm seconding the notion.
Second, okay, supporting the notion. Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Let us move on to
Yep.
these.
Yep.
Okay. So the next order of business is a discussion of capital budgeting, right? And so there's been an extensive, I think we've all provided different materials, different memos. We've all sort of weighed in, provided opportunities for others, for each other to sort of do some thinking in advance of this moment. So what I would like to, so the first thing that I noticed, and then maybe this will be a good place to begin, is we've all sort of had a different discussion of what strategy should look like for capital planning. I think Marcia put forward what she was calling an operational plan. And so she actually itemized some things for us to consider. Claudette Brochu mentioned strategic planning in the absence of not having a strategic plan, that she found it difficult to think beyond the more immediate fiscal years. Rob, in a memo that he emailed us but didn't make the packet, talked about the relationship to the town plan. And then I was interested a little bit in maybe perhaps more of an audit to see where we are rather than where are we going, particularly in the human resources capacity as they relate to our departments. And then Mary, I think you were interested in thinking through, I'm trying to recall.
Very interested in condition.
In condition, yes, you were thinking
And
about
condition.
in rubric.
And value, and not
Right.
sort of not having huge tax
Right.
swings.
And you mentioned in several cases, like developing a rubric for some of this. So that is all very different and from each other. I think a good place, let's begin a little bit with what Marcia put forward. And then let's all sort of talk about whether or not this would be, if we all find this useful for moving forward, or parts of it, or else parts of it, right? Or else none of it at all. So Marcia, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your operational planning as it relates to capital budgeting? Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, I think we're not all so far apart. I think it's just a matter of definitions. And, you know, I started out with the sort of notion that it's great if you've got a pot of money and a budget, but it's like, you know, if you're going to build a house, you first need to have a plan so that you know what kind of a house you're going to build. And I think of Norwich as our house. And I think that for that, we need something that I've just called for convenience an operational plan, but that may be what Claudette's thinking of more as a strategic plan. And I see it as distinct from the town plan, which is aspirational and which is, in terms of the law and the state, really the purpose is so that you can put in new zoning regulations. Otherwise, it's aspirational for what we see our town looking like. Therefore, having that aspiration, here's what we need for zoning regulations. And you're talking about an audit. I think that goes right toward the whole idea of what we need to do for building our house. And then, you know, Mary's talking about the conditions of things and keeping the taxes down. To me, it's all one and the same. And, oh, excuse me. Forgot about the phone.
Yeah.
So basically, I think I wanted to make sure that we had enough money to keep everything safe, keep the lights on, keep operating, and then first and foremost, get our money under control. I know Herb knows where everything is, but the rest of us don't. Not so much as he does. And I know that he's the one that's making the payments for things, but we need to be able to figure out, you know, as the statute lays out, this is the money that was voted that goes into the general fund, and we're going to operate our house expenses with that general fund. And here's the money for the highway fund, and here's reserve funds for all of those things that we have taken from the aspirational column and put into our operational plan. You know, it may be that this is the year we need to build the chimney. I'm just putting this into analogies of a house. And so we want to know that we've got the money for that chimney and it was voted and the townspeople know that we're going to do that. And I think in the process, we need to make sure that we're not putting anybody at risk. And that, you know, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about climate risks with the kinds of flooding that we've experienced. What monies do we have to make sure that everything is as good as it can be on that front? But, you know, maybe now that extends to public safety in terms of the police as well. So I really think we need to be looking at what's safe, and we need to look as a group at what's realistic for us to do every year on our operational plan that we're maintaining this house or building onto this house. And once you've got that, then I think it makes more sense to look at the capital budget, because now you're saying, I've got my house plans, I've got my accounts set up, and now I'm going to get the money and start operating. But the way we've been going, I feel a little in the dark that it's cart before the horse, and I don't know that I'm comfortable spending money without really knowing for myself what we've got and where we're going.
Okay. One follow-up question, and then I want to hear from some other folks. An operational plan, do you foresee this being a document that is written or affirmed every year by during each reorg?
Yes, I do. I think it gives you some place to start in terms of your budgeting, right? What are we going to be doing next year that we're going to need money for? So it might be we realize some bad stuff has happened and we really need to, you know, Tracy Hall burned down and we need to rebuild it. That would be bad, and that would take up all of our time and energy and presumably funding. But every year we could look at it and renew. It might be that we don't have any changes from year to year, but it might be that we're planning towards something bigger down the road.
Okay, thank you. Mary and Rob, did you have any follow-up to Marcia's what Marcia just said, and also some of her documents? And then I'll go to each of one of you to sort of do the same thing. Go ahead, Mary.
I like Marcia's ideas of knowing where we are. I like the safety aspect, and also keeping the lights on, which I think is maintenance. I think we have to know what we're immediately coming up on, but I also think we have to plan ahead And sometimes I think we forget to do that. For instance, we had police cruisers that were replaced because 3 of them burned, and I think out of insurance. And then that kind of got off the radar. And now, and then it kind of all needed to be replaced at once. So sort of staggering those kind of replacement costs, thinking ahead on that. Tracy Hall is sort of like, to me, is a sturdy matron. She served us well, and we've just ignored her. And, we might be wise to do a needs analysis on that, just so that we are prepared, so we don't have a situation like Marcia, you were saying, oh my gosh, Tracy Hall burned down, or some crisis happened at Tracy Hall, and suddenly we have to come up with a solution. So if there's a way for us to think about some of maybe the larger items, just how to put everything on a schedule, so that we're noticing it every year, and we've kind of planned it out. It is a 5-year spread, I think, that we're considering for a capital plan. Some of the things on it are probably 20-year timeline. Like if we consider the energy reduction, the 5% a year, well, that's a 20-year timeline. And that's a little hard to get our minds around. Like even 1 year is a lot. So
Right.
I think timelines are important. Figuring out if it is something like vehicles, I think you can put them on a replacement schedule. It's a little harder with buildings, but I think we should also, in our operational plan, be thinking of those sort of longer term aspects as well.
Right, because just to sort of, I'm gonna do this, and if it's annoying, tell me to stop. I'm gonna repeat it, repeat back what I'm hearing. So I think, Mary, yes, you're talking about CIP. You always reaffirm every year your capital plan, right? That's a function of capital planning. But I think you're also talking, Mary, about life cycle costs, and this is something that I'm interested into, and I know Claudette is as well. This idea, life cycle costs with some equity across departments, right? And then when you bring in sort of the through lines of energy, right, ensuring that those life cycle costs might look different for, say, a cruiser or for like a major vehicle, but understanding that we have an understanding of how those life cycle costs are applied, or when we're making an exemption, right, so to speak. But that's a little, but reaffirm, looking at capital every year is a function of our capital budgeting policy, right? But I think Marcia is actually looking to reaffirm things operationally every year, sort of separate from some capital a little bit, if what I'm hearing is correctly. So I'm just keeping that in mind. Rob, do you have any questions or thoughts from what you heard from Marcia? And then I'm gonna go to each of you.
I'm, as you mentioned, supportive of the town plan. And I'm also supportive of the concept of having a strategy on how we want to move forward with the town, and that involves some vision. It's only makes sense that you want to know what you're hoping to go to, what you're hoping to move towards, in order to make decisions. So, but it's not something that you have the luxury of ruminating before everything else gets taken care of. You still have to pay the bills. You still have to make sure the roads are maintained. You still have to keep the lights on. But the question would be, as far as immediate action, what do we do that acknowledges those requirements? Theoretically, you shouldn't have to spend a lot of time on them, but consider all other expenditures as to whether they take us forward toward a vision of what we want the town to be. So maybe it's, we want the town to be net zero in 2050. That affects all sorts of different decisions and expenses.
Right.
But without you need that vision. Go ahead.
I think just to to continue to reflect back. Being net zero is not the same thing as keeping the lights on, right? Mercifully, Herb keeps the lights on. He runs the town. We don't have to. But if we want to be net zero, there's a lot of policy directives that sort of, change, how we keep the lights on. So, and I mentioned this, Rob, because you talked about that in your memo, right? The making sure that we were thinking, I don't want to say more broadly, but thinking differently than how, than the charge of what the town manager form of government is. And then, but I do think, and Marcia acknowledged that a little bit of that when she was talking about some of our accounts. So I actually, but it also does us a service to educationally sort of know more about sort of how the lights are kept on, because it informs our thinking for the future. So I actually think it's very productive to, in the spirit of education, to sort of begin with an understanding of our accounts, right? And thinking about, how designated funds work with the operating capital budget as a form of financing, right? Because ultimately choosing to make appropriations to a designated fund for future expenses is but one form of financing in many ways. Like you could choose to bond at a low interest rate and take on debt rather than, taking money from the taxpayer every year. And some of this we would have the benefit of a finance committee's analysis, should that one day exist. But in the interim, we could learn more about our accounts. So I think that's a good place. So I'm hearing life cycle costs. I'm hearing education and an education around our accounts. These are things that Herb is entrusted with, but he can lead us. Well, not so much life cycle costs, but he can lead us through an educational understanding before we make any decisions. Okay, so that's helpful. Mary, is there anything about your, the one thing I'll offer, and because we're on sort of Marcia's bit, is, Marcia, I don't know if you had the opportunity to look through the packet and saw some of my comments in my memo about what you had said. And just to sum up, I thought of them more as what I was calling through lines, right? Rather than thinking them as like a set of criteria, I'm thinking them more as a set of touchstones, and taking the sort of topic of what you had written and then writing a descriptive sentence that would then define that, that idea, and then talking about how the department would sort of, how each department might touch on that. I don't know if you liked that, if it was a wrong application of your idea, but anyway.
I think it's a good application, but it's on, down in the weeds level.
Mhm.
And I think we really need to have the 60,000 foot level, so that we can see this is what we've got and this is what we're heading for, which goes to, the town plan. It goes to lots of things. So I think we need to be able to first and foremost look at what needs or wants to be done. And then in that context, once we have, call it a footprint or something, my operational plan, that's what we're budgeting for. And then it's just a matter, it seems to me, of saying, all right, we've got the money and now we're going to move forward on this year. And we accomplished that in 1 year. And we feel probably pretty good, as opposed to years when we feel like, we tried very hard and we're still working on this, right? And then at the end of that year, okay, the next phase of that, like Lego, the next phase is to do this thing. So that's part of our operational plan, which includes everything from keeping the lights on to building this next piece of the Lego block. And then you go to the I almost said the faculty, then you go to the voters and say, so do you want to vote this much money for this piece of the Lego that's part of our town vision? And then you put it in the accounts and you're off and running.
Yes. Okay. I think some of that will come out when we talk about sort of the highway fund and some of the designated funds and the voters' role in that, which I think might make sense as a good place to begin for next week. But Herb, I want to bring you a little bit in on this, because one of the things that you have said to me, and I believe this board, is that, you know, is that the capital budget, the draft capital budget plan put forward by department heads are the needs. So knowing that our department heads gave us their needs in this, how does it, I think you see where I'm going with this. Do we need to be talking about needs and wants if our department heads have already determined the needs with your advice?
So based on the knowledge that our department heads have, given their expertise and all that, given the information that they have currently before them, you have before you their particular needs, and that's in discussion with me as well, between what would be this, you know, the coming fiscal year and the subsequent 5 years after that. We clearly have an understanding from the budget process that some of the information needs to be updated. So there's a number of, to pick on Department of Public Works, there's a number of capacity studies that are going to be updated, culverts, bridges, road surface management, all that sort of thing, which will allow the Department of Public Works to have a updated view of where we stand with regard to stuff. Now that information is supposed to put out what are the deficiencies, what are the higher priority, you know, sort of like a color coded sort of thing. The red things will stand out to be those things of priority. So that sort of fits in with where I think Marcia and Mary are talking about, in terms of you're going to get a piece of part of the house that you have to rebuild, redo, or add on to. And the same thing, you get that additional level of priority thinking. But for now, you definitely have, I mean, you have to, respectfully, you have to embrace the fact that department heads have knowledge of their department and the operations that go with it and the things that need to operate that. Clearly, they understand that there are things that they need periodically to help them in making those decisions and establishing those priorities, such as those capacity studies. The body politic, of course, is the entity, you folks, that adopt that thing. You may have different priorities or policies that you make that may conflict or think differently or go along with what that's happened. That's a different level of priority that has to be established. It's one that I don't like particularly, but it's the fact of life with regard to municipal government and a capital budget and capital budget and programming process. Obviously, we would all like to be in sync so that when we get to body politic, that it's more of a rubber stamp than anything else, so that we're actually making decisions that are really rooted in what the actual needs are, how much funding that we have to deal with that sort of stuff, so that we don't have to have body politic making decisions that might become counter to actual boots on the ground type of stuff. I think that that's where, whether it's a finance committee, a town manager working with the select board, it's the discussion of stuff. As a, for instance, with town manager reports coming up in the future, what I'm trying to do is not just give you my written report and the written reports of the board members, but over the coming several months, I want to have an individual department head come in to give you, so the one that's coming in this next week is going to be Bree Swenson for rec department, because I want her to get first of all, having a face-to-face, giving you an update of where they stand, but allow the opportunity to have questions. So that's not the panacea, but it's a function of trying to, it's that education, Roger, I think, or whoever brought that up first, is that I think it's a piece of that education that needs to go with not only a broad-based spreadsheet or a matrix of information and a bunch of words that show a justification. I think it's just a piece of that bringing things along the way we go. But it is sorry for the little bit of the babble, but I want to make sure that there is an appreciation of staff, and what they do and their background and qualifications, that it isn't necessarily just because this document says X or that document says Y or a committee says Z. I think that it's all important, but I do think that we have to put a little faith in our department heads as well.
Okay, so Marcia, I see your hand, but I'm going to actually turn to Mary for a little bit, because one of the things that Mary asks in her memo is what specific information do we want to ask of our department heads, right? And, you know, she wants, there is some value in listing that and expressing that, and perhaps in documents that we've talked about, as a way to sort of validate, you know, their recommendations, right? Because we know that when they make a recommendation, they've met our standards. So Mary, do you want to, I just set you up. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of department heads, it does depend on what you're trying to do with your capital budget. I think if you're trying to keep the lights on, keep everything safe, keep the condition up, that's a different question than if you have a bold vision. And I don't want to lose the thread that Rob brought up. For instance, what kind of town are we? You know, are we a town where there can be diverse people, diverse income? Are we a town where there can be enough students for elementary school? And a lot of that's outside of our, you know, our job description, but it also does have to do, well, kind of yes and no, because it also has to do with the, you know, it's sort of like where the school and the town intersect. You know, it's really what kind of a town do we want to have? And I just think there's a balance between making sure we have enough resources to take care of what we have, but not losing sight of the fact that your town is always going to change, whether we want it to or not. But is there a vision for a town that we would agree that's positive for the future, whether it's energy or having diverse people? So I just don't want to lose track of that. And as far as what I was asking from department heads, it's really, I think, pretty much standard. It's like condition, replacement schedules, life cycles. There was a little bit about, once in a while, I think there might be a need to cross over departments. As I said in my memo, remote monitoring of HVAC systems. So that might be something where our internet, you know, our IT has to interact with all the departments for monitoring purposes. And another idea would be whether or not the Department of Public Works should maintain the recreation fields. So sometimes I think they cross over. I also think we don't have a lot of time. So when we sort this out, I think we're going to have to narrow it at some point. It's good to go broad, but then I think we're going to have to narrow it to something that's practical if we're going to get anything done by July. So, and as far as a point system, I brought that up because when we were struggling with the budget last fall, we came up with a sort of 4-year rolling average. It's sort of like we were kind of, our heads were spinning, and maybe we didn't understand as much as we should. We did come up with a system for dealing with it. So a rubric or a point system might be helpful to us, or it might be burdensome, but it at least it's a coherent method. You know, it's not us saying, well, I kind of like fire engines better, so let's concentrate on the fire department, or that's in pretty good shape. We don't have enough culverts. It's pretty hard to know how to prioritize.
Right.
I think.
Right. Once you decide to have a police department, how many cars are required, and then you just fund those cars, right?
Or any other department too, but yeah.
And then once you, exactly. So, and Marcia, I think Marcia's spirit behind Marcia's sort of operational thinking is that you would have done a lot of that pre-work going into a budget, right? Go ahead, Marcia, you have your hand up.
I was just going to say to Herb's point that I completely agree that the department heads are the experts. And that's, to me, keeping the lights on, that they know how to keep the lights on and what we need to do that. But some of that stuff is really expensive. And so that's the kind of stuff that I think, you know, Mary's talking about having the, you know, the schema of when things need to be replaced. That needs to go into our operational plan. I sort of see this operational plan as not things that are unrealistic, things that are realistic. All we're doing is saying, this is within our bandwidth this year. And we're going to work towards that. And here's the money. So our capital budget really can't be discussed intelligently until we know what we're going to use it for, because you can't just say we're going to have money, right? And so what I'm hoping to see is that we can take some of that stuff, you know, that's in perhaps the town plan and say, aspirationally, this is what people said that they wanted, and we think that we can do that, or take this step this year. And that we're going to put that in our operational plan for fiscal year 22, 23 or whatever, and then ask in our budget for that money to do it.
Okay. Herb, you have your hand up. Would you, Marcia, want to respond to Marcia's response to you?
No, it's that I wanted to, what was going through my head as soon as I last shut off my mic was, I want to make sure that you folks understand that when I say, you know, put faith in the department heads, the corollary is true as well. So that, in other words, there is value to body politic where you say, when we talk about life cycle. So if I know that you guys are in agreement with a general policy decision that the life cycle for, say, cruisers is 4 to 6 years, or a larger truck is 12 years, that gives the direction to the department heads that is extremely invaluable. So I'm supporting what Marcia is saying, because I think we're saying the same thing. I just want to make sure that we understand that there's an interface there, that I think department heads are looking for leadership from the board in terms of some policy direction. And I'm saying on the, you know, also on the corollary that please, you know, understand, just like Marcia said, she agrees that the department heads are where some of the professional qualifications are. And combined, that's getting at that where we can then pull together that overall vision or strategic plan that we want to move toward. So I just want to make sure you guys understood the corollary is true to what I had said.
Right, and I appreciate that, Herb. And it's funny because I think probably an operational plan or a yearly work plan will be much easier next year if we begin to do some of the work that makes an operational plan easy to do, right? So like right now, I'm hearing a conversation about life cycle costs, right? I'm hearing a conversation about replacement schedule, which I guess is also a little bit of, can you hear me?
That's related. Yeah, it's sort of breaking up a little.
You froze, but
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Whoa, it's because I have all these tabs about chickens on my computer.
Oh, get those chicken tabs off of there.
Okay, so I don't know where I left off, but what I was saying is that there are things or documents to be produced that could inform an operational plan. So it's this cart before this horse, this chicken before the egg, that will make this year more difficult for that operational planning. Anyway, I continue to parrot back what I'm hearing, but Rob, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the part of that vision of where we want the town to go, I think inherently requires that some of those movements be done by article, that the voters every year that we think we could do something a little out of ordinary, a little beyond what would be considered normal in a slow but steady movement would have to be a warrant article.
So something, Matt Sweat's here, he's probably getting nervous, but something like a fire truck, which has been diligently squirreled away through designated fund expenditures, might also be the kind of purchase that in the future is an article, right? Because that is, there's another truck that is being slated after this one, right? And that we could squirrel away, something like $70,000 a year to be able to afford that one next, or it could be bonded with a vote from the people, right? And so that's a different kind of body politic too. And to what extent is it almost like Brexit to like put something before the voters, like as opposed to something that deserves the discussion and decision making of their legislative body, right? So there's also that trickiness. The comparison is not equal, but I think you appreciate it. Okay. Go ahead, Marcia.
I was just going to say, I think by articling it and putting the money in a reserve fund and avoiding bonds, which, or anything that would cause interest, we're keeping this a more affordable place. We're keeping the taxes down, and we're responsibly planning for the future.
Good, Mary.
I think too that people in this town give a great deal of scrutiny to bonds. And I think they're more, I think it makes them very nervous. I think that idea of a designated fund that's well thought out, that you've got the professionals in the fire department working out, they know the specifics of the equipment that is needed. And it's very expensive equipment. When you have to bond something, you really kind of sow the seeds of doubt also in citizens. And I think rightly so, because they want to know the value, but they don't have the perspective that the chief and the volunteer fire department people have. They don't have that knowledge that has been built up over years and years. So I'm, a little leery of bonding out anything that's not absolutely necessary.
And I'm similarly worried, and I would be similarly, I appreciate the ways in which it doesn't become body politic by seeking voter advisory or otherwise, but there is also, there's also a sense that you don't necessarily, you don't always have the most engaged public, right? And I've heard more than one occasion that like, oh, we elect people so that way, we trust you and you make these decisions too, which is, an idea to be scrutinized as well. But it's this idea that, as you were saying, Mary, there's something to have lived with a decision and have all of the information ready and accessible to you versus someone who is needing to make a decision often the day of, right, and don't have the benefit of being informed. So I would say it's a different kind of body politic too, but we're getting intellectual. I'm getting intellectualizing of it. Go ahead, Rob.
So the difference, there are times when I look at bonding and I look at it over a longer term and what's the total cost to the taxpayer going to be. So for instance, if you're looking at a hefty expense, and I supported the alterations to Tracy Hall, and as an example, if you slowly build up the funding for that, every year it would increase the cost of accomplishing the task. And it may increase, inflation may end up being higher than the bonding cost at the time you make the decision to go that route. And what's the total cost of that investment? Is the money cheap enough to bond at that it's going to save money to the taxpayer by the time the bond is paid off? Not saying that's a requirement, but there are times when that makes sense.
And that was an interest of Claudette as well, where she was interested in life cycle replacement schedules, and life cycle costs were really intimately linked for her. I think I don't know if people got that read from her memo. She's not here. But I think for her, she was really looking to see life cycle costs, not necessarily from, from an industry standard or from someone's expertise, but she was also interested in that sort of that space where it becomes too expensive to maintain it anymore and it's not worth it, right? So, which I think actually would stretch the life cycle a little bit longer than other recommendations. So is that fair to say? Herb, you unmuted.
I just wanted to sort of add to it that you know, that's the Tracy Hall is a great example where you either have intersecting or competing interests. So this town is very, you know, green friendly and wants to move forward to get rid of the use of fossil fuels. So as you may recall, the discussion, you know, that Rob just raised is that I think that the group that was moving forward with this wanted to go out and do a bond because it was more important to get the fuel use out and transfer to a cleaner source of energy. And it was worth capitalizing on the lower bond interest amount to be able to do that for the sake of moving forward with the green stuff. If we clearly, you know, to pick up on what Marcia's saying, because I agree with her as well, that we want to stow away money that's earning interest rather than paying interest down the road, because that's too is in the best interest of the community. But in Tracy Hall, I think you had some, whether it's intersecting or competing interests, there's this added level of discussion that you needed to have, I think, as policymakers to make that particular decision. To add to that a little complexity, as you know, Roger, the boilers downstairs here in Tracy Hall are at the end of their, you know, cycle of life. And so if we proceed forward and we're forced to replace those, this brings up John Langus's point from the past. Well, it's easy to go through and replace those, but then all of a sudden now you got a unit for 25 or 30 more years that's using fossil fuel. So in that instance, what's the bigger form of interest? Is it moving the green or some saving some tax dollars? That's, you know, and again, that's a great point that Rob made.
And because with that lens as well, suddenly individual capital assets like a boiler, right, become very much a capital project like Tracy Hall at large, right? And so, and then, you know, a capital project may require a different kind of financing than a capital asset, right? And so, so I think what I'm taking from this conversation, and I'll move on, is that defining what a capital asset is, understanding life cycle costs, understanding our funding, like how our accounts and how things are funded and managed, are all things that have come up. And then the big point of seeing this not just from keeping the lights on, but understanding when there's a policy layer that's about the future. So anybody have any more comments? And then if not, I'm gonna suggest a plan for what we do next. Go ahead, Mary.
I think it would be, I think for this year, it might be that we just focus on keeping the lights on and getting a grip on things. We've also been dealing with, just dealing with that horrific storm damage, which kind of threw us off our game. I don't know if we really have the oomph to do anything visionary, you know, whether it's energy or, you know, I'd like to make it easier for affordable housing to happen in our town. Or what if we just wanted to welcome a few immigrants? You know, what if we wanted to do something really outside the box? I just don't think we have the oomph to do it this year. I'd like it, but I just don't know if it's just gonna, I think, ball up our process. We're so bogged in process right now, just trying to adopt this plan, really.
Well, I would argue that just a reminder, there is strategic things happening too. We do have an Article 36 task force, which is thinking strategically about climate. We do have a childcare committee that is thinking about our childcare needs and will have recommendations. And then, you know, we have preliminary discussed an imagination of what the future of policing looks like in Norwich too, right? So I think all of these things, and I think Herb's made this point too, like some of these things that sort of seem like keeping the lights on actually become strategic or are strategic in their outset. And just because you're not enacting something in a year, as you were saying, Mary, doesn't mean that you're not, you know, planning for the future.
Maybe they would be more for the second year or the third year. You know, that we're trying to lay some groundwork, I think, with some of these committees. But as far as what we would do this year, it would depend. Like the Article 36, they're gonna kind of brief us in July, childcare committees July. And don't forget affordable housing. That's huge for this town. And that's been bogged down since the 1990s. We could solve that, it would be a miracle. So,
Go ahead, Marcia. And then I want to ask if people still see ourselves as being able to have a vote of affirmation by August. But go ahead, Marcia.
I mean, it seems to me like we've just articulated the operational plan for this year. We've already got Article 36, the Child Care Committee, and policing. I mean, that's a lot.
it is a lot.
And keeping the lights on. So as we go through this year, why don't we just keep a little notebook of things that we think, oh, for our next operational plan, maybe we'll be able to reach these things. Just
Right.
kind of make it organic.
Right. Go ahead, Rob.
So one of the things that comes to play here is, and maybe Herb knows more about what's going on, maybe you do, Roger, I'm not sure, but when the state and federal funds hit, how we have to justify what we spend things on. And, but at the same time, we should be thinking, is there any overlap between those, my concept of a strategic plan, and fulfilling the requirements of expending that money wisely? If you don't consider all the different ramifications that could be involved in having that money to work with, you're just, you're cutting yourself short.
Right. That's smart. Go ahead, Marcia.
I haven't sent them around yet, but my notes on the Bernie Sanders telephone call, and leaving aside the fact that some monies may be restricted in their use, people were talking about all sorts of interesting things, like ski towns were talking about giving some of that money to hoteliers to help them because they had struggled, that sort of thing. I think really that will be a time to think outside the box. But unless there's some sort of demand that the money be spent in a certain amount of time, I think it shouldn't burn a hole in our pocket. It should go into an account, and we think carefully about how we're going to spend it.
Right.
And I think Herb is getting ready, and Cynthia are getting ready to do that, to make sure that we understand clearly what the guidelines are before we touch a penny of it. And I think Governor Scott has said, well, don't, use it for sort of more of a one-time thing. Like, don't create something that might have maintenance requirements that you can't take care of later.
Right.
Why?
So we're gonna jump. We have like a half an hour left of our advertised end time, and then we'll get to some other, because people had other conversations. We wanted to talk about sort of our work on supervising or overseeing and supporting the work of committees, some other policy ideas that we wanted to do. So I want to get to that, but I want to sort of put a little bit of a ribbon on capital. So I had some items here, some bullet points for next steps. Mary had actually some similar ideas that she wanted to calendar out a little bit. And I want to see what we think of these, and then I want to think a little bit about how Marcia might sort of go back and revise some of her documents for our following meeting as well. So what I said, I think we should begin, maybe not next week, but maybe the following, with a shared understanding of the town of Norwich's accounts, the town's historical use of designated reserve fund financing and spending, and current statute allowances. I think do you see that?
Yeah, what if we already agree on it tonight?
So I think if we wanted to do that, is that something we would like to do? That's what I'm trying to suss out. So I think Marcia has had raised some questions. I think it's just an educational thing that we should walk through. So I think we should do that for. So is there a yes or a no?
There
Yeah,
are
are you saying a motion or what?
No, I'm looking for consensus. So basically I see some of these bullet points as possible things we want to explore further for capital planning.
So I say yes on bullet number 1.
Okay. And then,
How will
so,
we know? Okay, how will we know when we have a shared understanding? We have to be able to attain this, right?
mhm.
And by when?
Well, I think that is, well, first, do we want a shared understanding of the town of Norwich's accounts? Or do we already feel like we have it?
I feel like I have a basic understanding of how they're put together.
Okay.
I might not understand, exactly why, always why certain amounts are asked for. But just in having looked at several budgets, I can see how it's put together. I don't know, what do we need to know here?
Sorry, Mayor. There we go. Sorry. Wouldn't that be a lot of what's in the justification that I provide you for the operational budget? I mean, there is a lot of information in there, but if you need to know every single line item and what's in it, I try to put in there specifically what are the root, I call it assumption pages. So the assumptions that are built into line items.
I think there's an interest in understanding sort of the stated purpose of each designated fund, right? I think Marcia had questions about why you would have these, like why you would have either the efficacy or the statutory reason for why you would have these individual designated funds, right? So, I'm not saying we need to spend so much time on it, but I'm saying if there's something educational to be had around that, we could discuss it. Go ahead, Marcia.
To me, it goes more to compliance, that, we know that there are some monies that are supposed to be spent only on highways, and that there is a statutory description of what a highway fund is, and a statutory description of what a general fund is for paying your, keeping the lights on stuff. And then reserve funds are for those articles that you vote and you have the money, so that instead of a designated fund being submerged in a general commingled fund, which, I mean, I always use ridiculous sort of analogies, but if somebody's hit by a bus and that is the one person who knows about those accounts, we're under the bus as well. So we really should be able to look at stuff and say, there's the general fund and these are the things that are paid out of it. Here's the reserve fund and we're saving for that fire truck and we've got this much money for it. It should be
Yeah.
intuitive.
Right. So in other words, like one of the questions you could ask is, this designated fund is the fire apparatus designated fund, and it has 500, let's say it has $500,000 in it, and in FY21 there's a 495,000 truck, but in FY23 there is another one slated, and so you have to then. So in other words, so I think there's a desire to make sure to take a sort of a stock of what's in these funds, and then to see that if there's enough money in it. So in other words, one of the things we do is body politic. We go through, and there isn't necessarily a data-driven way where we say, well, why do you need $60,000? We're going to give you $20,000 this year. And we're saying well, if there has to, and I think we're saying that it's always 60 unless there's a reason why it's not 60 this year, right? Because something has changed with the department structure, or because we're making a values-based decision about that department, whatever it is. I think Marcia is saying. So I think now I finally understand a little bit more what you're saying, where you want to understand sort of the stated statutory reasons, but you also want to understand why is it that if we need 60,000, why is it the board hasn't funded that over the year? Okay.
And I also want to know, apparently we used to do it this way. We used to have those separate funds, and then we stopped. And it seems to me if the statute says these funds are for this purpose for a town, I'm worried that we should have those funds and not commingle money.
I don't
So
see the
my question-
commingling part. What, can you
Yeah.
explain the commingling part, please, Marcia?
Herb has
Yeah.
his hand up, but go ahead, Marcia.
Okay.
My understanding was that the general fund has got the whatever reserve funds or undesignated funds in that general fund. So instead of having the statutory reserve fund, we're actually, Herb is keeping track of it within one fund. That was my understanding. So to me, that's a commingling of, and the highway funds are in there too. Highway funds, general funds, reserve funds, all in one bank account with one number.
But isn't it like having a book with different chapters and sub-chapters? I mean, it's sort of like a big outline.
Except
Does
that
it seem that way to you?
except that the statutes say that you should do it differently.
Although the metaphors are confusing me now. It's a house, it's a book. Go ahead, Herb. What metaphor will you use to help us out right now?
To clarify, the statute enables a transportation fund separate and apart from the general fund. The town of Norwich, while I'm perfectly happy having a transportation fund separate from the general fund, as we currently operate in Norwich, we just have a general fund that includes transportation related stuff in it. In other words, a DPW operation. So it's not that it's wrong. The statute enables that. Many communities have the separate transportation fund. We just either have decided not to go that route. Historically, have just done that and not done it, but it doesn't mean that we can't move forward with having something. I appreciate what Marcia is saying with regard to the value of that. That in terms of the designated funds, I think the other question that's coming up is what is the rudimentary purpose of those designated funds originally? That's part of the question here. It's not just a function of what's in it and what we're going to spend it on, but it's making sure that first of all, we know what it's for, and that we indeed are spending those monies on what was originally intended. So that's a piece of it. The other part of that is that I was trying to work with Manu when he was chair of the finance committee. He was asking me, how could the finance committee help my office? And my thing was what I did when I was over in Fairhaven, because we had this exact same question about 4 or 5 years ago. And what I was wanting to work with them was, it seems awful silly that that we just keep, like, oh, the standard thing that we do every single year is to raise $25,000 to go into X fund, X designated fund, a reserve account. And there's really no, the justification for it was, well, this is the fund that we use to buy X equipment. But it was always $25,000 and there was no sort of like end in sight. We just kept raising the same amount. So what I had asked Manu to work on, or to help me work on, was to say, what should be the ceiling amount on that designated fund?
Right.
So if we're looking to, and this is where the purpose of the capital budget comes in as well, is that if we know for the coming few years that we need to spend this amount of money out of the designated funds for these certain pieces of equipment or whatever, we should have an idea of what is at least the glass ceiling that it shouldn't exceed. And we can figure out on an annual basis, what is the actual amount that we need to raise in order to get to that goal? Maybe a part of the policy that you establish is to say, well, $15,000 we need every single year to be able to purchase that cruiser in the future. But we also want to anticipate the next cruiser after that. So we're going to add an additional 10 grand to that. But when we buy that cruiser, maybe we only need thereafter to be putting $10,000 in there. So you're establishing what are the criteria moving forward. So that's a critical piece of where I think your decision making can be involved in this particular process. But the other part of this is that there isn't this overall blend of the designated funds all together. And I mean, yes, it's in one mashed account under the general ledger, but they're all separate funds accounted for separately, so that there isn't that intermingling of funds as it pertains to a fund and a modified accrual basis of accounting. And then the last point I want to make is that of course I'm losing my train of thought because it was something Marcia mentioned, but I wanted to clarify. Oh, the reserve fund. the one thing that you guys can do to move forward on, and this is playing into the hands of what Claudette and Marcia, and that I've added some input to, is that get rid of that undesignated fund balance sort of policy. Ask the voters this coming, the next town meeting, next March, to establish an emergency reserve fund, and ask them additionally to shift some portion of the undesignated fund balance that is the equivalent of your current policy, that 12 or 16% amount, and ask them to shift that amount of money from the undesignated fund balance to that reserve fund. That's that emergency reserve fund that Marcia talks about, that she and Claudette are working on for your policy, because that's what keeps that's when, when the town Tracy Hall blows up and we need to do something, that's the fund, that's the amount of money that you use. The problem with the way that it's currently set up is that your policy is fine, but let's take us back to the incident where we had the July 1 storm. You had a negative fund balance, undesignated fund balance of $200,000 within 2 years after that storm. So if Tracy Hall had blown up that year, you didn't have any money to keep the town moving.
Right.
So the one thing you can totally agree to is to establish that emergency reserve. And that fits exactly with what Marcia's been talking about. And it's a simple as pie thing. You just have to wait until the voters next vote. And then you protect that. And for the future, you just look at your previous year, whatever your policy is, 12 to 16%. You look at what your previous year's operational budget is. You figure out what the 12 to 16% range is. If it's anything different, if the balance of the fund at that point is anything less than that, then you put in the budget amount of money to go into that to get you to that level. And that just occurs on an annual basis. And then those funds are secure, whereas they're not secure right now.
Okay. So this is to answer Mary's question, or Mary's I don't want to say doubt, or like why it's maybe worth talking about.
Yeah.
But
Challenge.
so I think some of it is policy, as Herb just alluded to, with this undesignated fund balance policy and its relationship with creating a reserve fund. But I think, and then also looking at sort of the efficacy of a transportation fund and the meaning and purpose of each designated fund. But then what I'm also interested in, and I don't know if anyone else has mentioned this, is this criteria for our designated funds. I would like to have a policy that takes a little bit of this body politic out of it, so that way when a board decides not to fund a designated fund at a criteria, it is known to be that board's decision, right? So does that make sense? Go ahead, Marcia.
Example?
So an example is like, let's say that you have a capital budget, right? And you adopted it, it's for 5 years. And that part of that is you're saying that the designated funds for each of these departments have to be funded at the following levels to achieve that. And that means every year, if you make an adjustment, the board is making an adjustment either for something that has happened operationally, that why they have to make a different course, or because the board is making a value-based decision that is different. And that's fine, but there's a policy that suggests that for the adoption of the capital budget, this is probably the capital budget policy, you'll have funding recommendations for each one of these designated funds.
Well, that's kind of the definition of the reserve fund in the statute.
Yes, but we don't do it. We don't do that, right? Because my understanding of the practice is the way that we've been sort of thinking of our designated funds as operational rather than capital, and that's why we are where we are. Rob and Mary, do you have any? Am I making sense? Herb is giving me a face, so maybe I'm not characterizing this.
Well, I was recalling that we had the document fairly recently that exposed the levels in every one of the funds, and there was like an endless list of fund and fund balances and so on. And what that was missing to me, but is a different process is, as people have been saying, what was the original intent of this fund that we now know we have $42,000 in? Was it a fund established for a specific purchase, or was it a fund established for use for a specific committee or sort of project? And so it would be nice to have that information, so we would need to know whether we needed to fund it every year to bring it up to a usable level, or if it's fine just to leave it where it is until it's needed.
Well,
Go ahead,
may I?
Marcia. Yeah, please.
The other part of that is that it's really important, according to the statute, that, things that are for the general fund, if we don't use it in that year, it's got to be returned to the voters. Whereas things that are for the highway, those are just for the highway and may carry over. So it's really important to know. And, I don't know if there's ever any like audit by the state or something, but what about those gasoline tax revenues, right? If that's supposed to come and be put into a special fund and not be used for anything else, could someone trace that and find that that was actually in fact the case, that it was not used for anything else? That's the kind of thing that I worry about. Was that money commingled and used for something else, or was it put into the highway fund?
Herb, go ahead. You were nodding and we're about to talk.
Just if you decide to establish a transportation fund, again, I've dealt with that, no big deal from that standpoint. Marcia's correct that if you have a separate transportation fund, you as a board, if you have an overage for a surplus at the end of a particular year, you as a board alone can act to spend that money as you see fit, but it has to be within the bounds of transportation related activity. In a general fund situation, so say you have both separate funds, a general fund and a transportation fund. The general fund alone, you cannot spend as a board without voter authority. Okay, so the value to have so in general, if you have, like right now, we don't have a transportation fund. So at the end of any year, if you want to spend money that's a surplus for something, you have to ask the voters to do that. Frankly, you have a policy that says our emergency reserve is 12 to 16% of the previous year's thing, and the undesignated fund balance is where you look to do that. So every year you essentially look at your undesignated fund balance, you say whether you're in that or not, and the past boards have done some illegal stuff, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. But the net is that any amount that's, if you read your existing policy, any amount that's over that 16%, you have to ask the voters how it should be spent. So basically your statute, you're following your statute in terms of your policy. You just haven't followed your policy the last few years, as a for instance. So now the use of that can be to go and buy down the tax rate, which I'm not going to get into philosophically why I totally tell you not to do that, but you've done it before. But you ask people to purchase, you can use it to go into you can basically use it to go into a designated fund, purchase a piece of equipment, or do something that's, say, in a particular fiscal year, but you have to ask the voters to spend that. You can't do that alone. That's the net difference from that.
So I think we've just got a little bit of a primer as to why I think we should talk about this again with the assistance of like more clarity. Like Herb has heard a lot of what we're saying, and I think he could be in a position to like help us out with this with a follow-up. And thanks to Marcia for identifying some of this for us, right? So is there consensus to move that forward as part of a capital budget conversation or not?
To move what forward?
The conversation about transportation fund, undesignated fund balances, true purposes, stated purposes of our designated funds, and then possible and possible status, and including their status of how much money they have and if there's enough money in them to cover their current capital allocations.
Are you suggesting that there could be future motions on one or more of these items?
I'm saying there could be a future motion to possibly affirm a memo or affirm an understanding. So you asked, how would we prove that we have a shared understanding? Someone under the supervision of our town manager would write it up, and then we adopt an understanding of it, as I think that would be something we would do.
So for the list that you just, the list that you just enumerated, someone would produce a document, and then we would look at it and say, yeah, this is what we think. That's what you're suggesting?
Can
Yeah.
I suggest something, Mr. Chair, is that maybe Marcia and I could get together and draft a joint letter for the board's consideration? And that Marcia, would be things like the transportation fund, general fund, that sort of stuff. And we can make a suggestion. Again, just maybe it would be good for a couple of us to work on something to put it together, talking about some of these issues so that it's easier. You got a piece of paper to look at instead of trying to figure out what the whiteboard says.
I think I think that's good. Go ahead, Marcia.
Aren't we just talking about your bullet number 1?
Yeah, we're
Yes.
still talking about bullet number 1. So we have other bullets before we can move on, but yes.
I'm happy to do that with her.
Okay.
I think that sounds good.
Yes, and then we
Well-
could, there may be some structural changes that come out of this. There just might be some shared understanding.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Well, that took a lot out of me, bullet point number 1. Okay. So we have a couple more bullets. I'm going to skip bullet point number 2 for now and move on to one that Mary and I think we're interested in, which is a stakeholder style set of interview questions for all department heads for the specific intention of understanding growth opportunities and pain points. I'm seeing.
So, yeah, I mean, pain points being the barriers, the
Yes.
constrictions.
Yes.
And growth being that perhaps the one that falls into this category for me is the recreation fields possibly being maintained by DPW, whether or not that is a good idea, or what could be the cost benefit of enhanced internet and website and monitoring equipment, that sort of thing.
Right.
I
And I
see
think,
practical applications of that.
yeah, and I think the second one is a question that can be applied across departments, and the first one is specific. So I would say the stakeholder style questions would be questions that we can ask of all departments equally as a place to begin. So like, yeah, do you feel like you're having all of your IT needs being met would be a stakeholder question, I think, as opposed to like, as opposed to talk to me about Huntley Field, it's maybe the fire department can't, that's not a question the fire department would be able to answer necessarily. So we want questions that that they can all answer.
Agreed.
Okay. Mary, you
I
were
think
interested
so.
in this. So
Yeah.
I went forward with this because you were interested in it, but now you're skeptical, I think.
No, I'm not. It's just sort of like the devil's always in the details. Just that if we can organize this nicely so that the questions, they help us, to help the town, but also they're also going to help the departments
Yeah.
do their best job. So how you ask the question is really important, like how you put that together, I think.
So would you like to work on that with me?
Sure.
Okay. Is the board okay with that?
Good.
Okay, cool. Bullet point number 3. I'm skipping to 4. Common agreement on what defines a capital asset and to what fidelity this definition can be applied across departments. So a capital asset is generally anything that's, I think in our current policy, it's something like a building is $25,000 or more, and an individual asset is 5,000 or more, but then there's one of the examples of a contradiction is there was a shed proposed for the transfer station at $12,000. And so obviously it didn't meet the threshold for the amount, but it was going to be around for a good 20 years. Thus it was defined as an asset. Do we want to talk about that a little bit together, or do we feel like Herb can make some recommendations and we could affirm it? Go ahead, Marcia.
I mean, it seems to me that that kind of is a significant thing, what we determine is a.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
sorry.
I think it would be good if we could all agree that maybe it's a and/or situation, you know?
Okay.
So it's $25,000 or it has a lifespan of whatever, you know, something like that. But we all think about it.
And I think the capital budget policy does sort of have the and or, but it might be good maybe just touching base on some like practicality a little bit, because some equipment, right? I think this is maybe a pain point of Claudette's, where some equipment in DPW is a capital asset collectively, right? So it might say something, I'm not.
Like lawn equipment or
Right.
landscaping equipment. That would
Right.
cover quite a few types of tools and
Right.
devices and things. But is
Right.
that wrong? I mean, I think we should debate that, but it can, I think, get into the point of maybe a board member wanting to know what kind of chainsaw is being used. I could get a little bit in the micromanaging direction, I would say.
I think you're right,
So-
and I think Herb is bringing forward an asset inventory that that will be helpful to decide if we want to talk about the lawnmower or what have you. But go ahead, Marcia, you had your hand up.
Well, I mean, I just sort of think a reasonableness component should apply, you know, I mean, a chainsaw might be not a capital asset unless somebody says it has to be gold plated, right? And then it becomes a capital asset. So I think a reasonableness component could be built into it, but we should probably decide if we're going to be spending a lot of money on something, what is the definition of a capital asset?
I think that's true, but I think that we should consider when we are deliberating the sort of aggregate idea, like landscaping equipment. Maybe there'd be a standard. I think there should be an energy standard personally, but also a quality standard. But I think sheds are a little bit of they're kind of one of those things where you can argue it either way. And, the DPW is such a big sprawling department. It's such a lot of, the town funds go into that it's like, wow, if we could just get control of DPW, we'd be, doing a great thing for the town. But we may also just not really understand how it's put together. And they may have, perfect need for that shed that costs 12,000 instead of 15,000. Even to protect equipment. So I don't know.
Herb, can you think of some contradictions in how a capital asset is defined, or not contradictions? Can you talk about how, very quickly, because I want to move on, how a capital asset is defined differently across departments, if at all?
So frankly, there's a difference between a capital asset and a capital
Expenditure?
expenditure, so to speak. So the capital asset is really more something for auditing purposes. It's clearly buildings, major pieces of equipment, vehicles, but it can also include roadway segments, culverts, all that sort of stuff. It's really a function of what you in town decide to depreciate as a function of your finances. That's capital asset. Capital item, capital project, that sort of stuff as it pertains to a capital budget and program are the things that you're talking about. The fleet, the piece of equipment, what have you from that standpoint. So there is a general difference in that category, even though there's clearly an overlap between the two. In municipal sides of things, depreciation we still have to keep it or maintain that for the auditor, but we really don't do depreciation in this community like either some communities do or what have you, because that's where true life cycle cost discussions come in, is that if you're going to go through and depreciate a piece of equipment, you're kind of writing it off. But because we don't pay taxes, it's depreciation really isn't a piece of it, other than a discussion about when are you going to have to replace that piece of equipment or do something to that particular building. There is a policy, Roger, that I just emailed you, which is Putney, Vermont's policy. That with some of the discussion I've had with Cynthia Stoddard is from Putney. So that may be somewhat of a starting point to say, what are those thresholds that you want to look at from that standpoint? I think they use $5,000 as a baseline. For me, it's hard because with DPW, something that's an operational expense for them might be the equivalent of a capital expenditure for a much smaller department, like planning and zoning or something along those lines. And even a comparison of a DPW item here in Norwich that's a capital project, something like $25,000, that may be an operational item in Burlington, Vermont, because again, they may only care about things that are $100,000 or more, or a fleet turnover of say 5 vehicles or 10 vehicles rather than just one. So you can define it the way that you want to. I usually try to say with particular people something like $5,000. And again, that's a little bit of a, there's no science to it. It's more an art.
So, and this is, and so then I'll make this point too, because it relates to what you just said. If you wanted to say, and with DBW equipment, there's individual expenditures. Let's say there's the lawnmower, right? There's the gator or what have you. But if you wanted to say, we're going to make it a capital project because we're going to electrify all of these small engine vehicles as part of our goals for net zero, and we're going to, we're going to also install a power wall, right? And so then suddenly all that equipment, which might be more not qualify as an asset, suddenly does. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think we do maybe need to talk about this a little bit more.
We have options of how to talk about it. We've got some flexibility.
Yeah.
And there might be certain, certain categories that they're just different from each other, but they're still valid.
Okay, so I'm hearing some consensus. I hope I'm hearing some consensus on that. Rob, are you nodding or? Okay. I'll nod. Okay, cool. Thank you. And then same with life cycles. And then these things, consult or amend the policy as our discussion progresses on that. And then the two, I think we agree, we need to affirm a replacement schedule. And then Herb has sent me all of these capital asset inventories for departments, and I confess that I haven't had the time to put it together in something that's friendly to Zoom, but I will. What has been missed? One of the things that we missed is the through line. I want to sort of think through Marcia's document as a board document. And I don't know what have we given Marcia enough feedback if we were to ask her to amend that for us, or to do we have any?
I'd love an explanation of the term through line. Is that a common thread or
Rogers.
Yes, yes. I've accidentally co-opted Marcia's operational plan and instead redubbed it. No. So yeah, through line is yes something that could be that is a point of reference for all of our work. I was thinking how it could be paired with John Pepper's vision, Selectboard vision that he paid to mount on the back of that multi-purpose room, in the spirit of sort of not abandoning past work of past boards, right? Can you take that vision statement and then can you take some of these operational ideas and put them together a little bit more? But I think Marcia talked in the space of this meeting, talked about how she might revise it to talk about sort of, 4 things. I think it was energy, and Article 36 task force, the childcare, and
And the
policing.
police,
So I don't know,
Keeping the lights on.
and keeping the
and
light.
keeping the lights on, right?
Do you want me to take a stab at that and throw it back to you?
If the board agrees, I think there might be some value in having it.
Would it be along those thematic lines of, of through lines, or Marcia, you kind of simplifying your operational plan, or what? I don't understand.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely understand, so I was going to take a stab and see if we could all begin to understand it, but
Okay,
be using Roger's through lines and my operational plan and the 4 things that we've all agreed on that we're going to tackle this year.
that sounds
And
good.
then I think I need to talk to Herb first so that we can get our minds straight about the town accounts, and make them more compliant with statute and comfortable for us. And then we have something. So I don't think that's too tough, and I'll give it a stab. When would you like it?
Not next meeting, so maybe the second meeting in May at the earliest.
Okay. Can I have some of your time, Herb?
Yes, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just give me a call, or I'll call you, whichever, and we can figure out our calendars. There's just that there's a week somewhere in May that I have to go move. So, yeah.
So, okay, so I think we have some, Mary and I are going to work on these stakeholder questions that we want to ask of all departments. There's going to be some, and then we'll sort of schedule out this conversation about defining what an asset is, and what and how we're defining life cycle costs. I'm going to lean on Herb for whatever I end up putting together for that. Marcia's going to revise her operational plan, thinking through some of these, what we're calling maybe through line considerations. And I think that's enough for, for having
So-
the capital budget conversation.
Right, now we have one date on that, which is the Marcia revising her operational plan. Do we want dates on any of this stuff? Or-
I
or
think,
sort of-
how about I come back with some dates for what I just discussed, and for our next meeting, so we could
Think about
affirm
it.
then, yeah.
Okay.
And that's coming up fast, so it's not too much of a delay.
Yes, it is.
Welcome, Claudette. I see that you're there.
Oh, Claudette.
I'm here, but I'm not going to show my face because I look like the wreck of the Hesperus right now.
Oh,
That's understood.
Things
Thank-
are okay, though. Things are
Okay.
okay.
Okay,
So,
that's good. Your voice sounds strong.
just
so,
a stressful afternoon.
yes,
Mm.
okay.
And I'll watch the video so I can keep, I can be apprised of what you guys all talked about.
Yes, your name was evoked and your ideas, so you can confirm if we were representing them well. Okay, so how about if this is good, I would like to propose that we take a 10-minute break and then move on to some of the other sort of goal setting stuff that we had, if that's okay, because it's past the time. We were supposed to end at this time, so I'm asking for your permission, so to speak.
Sure.
Fine.
I like the 10-minute break and then keep going.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. So it's 8:08, so 8:18. Okay. See you then. All right, resuming the Wednesday, May 5th special select board meeting at 8:18. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is just sort of wider goal setting outside of capital budgeting, right? So where would we like to begin? My memo tried to collect what I had heard were shared interests, but we can begin wherever folks like. Would we like to discuss sort of the committee support stuff?
Which page are you looking at on your?
So
Got it.
I'm looking at, uh, so
The
my,
first page, isn't it?
it was agenda item, okay, so it was what?
3.
page? I think so. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's the same memo as capital under town committee work. Is that what
Yes.
we're looking at? Yeah. Okay, so
But
it's
no-
that same memo, Friday,
we-
April 23rd.
But we don't have to discuss that. But we could. Or is there something that people, is there a pressing goal that people want to start with?
I would like to have a goal of not doing too much.
Okay.
I feel
Or-
like I just feeling like, especially childcare committee, keeping track of that, doing the policy work. To me, it takes, I'm not retired. I'm working, so I don't want to load too many other things on. So
Yeah.
I'm saying,
Yeah. Well, I have a 6-month-old and 11 chickens, so I hear you on that one.
well, I have 4 chickens and a cat, so whatever.
Yes, but yeah, point well taken. Like, this is not any of our
I
jobs.
want to do it well. I want to do it well. So I just feel like I don't want 3 more things to do. I can think of a lot of things I'm interested in. I just think, like, coming back to the affordable housing, coming back to how childcare intersects with that, how it intersects with income disparity in this town, means that kind of issue that it's always in the back of my mind. And I don't have any way to work on it, really. But that's kind of eating at me all the time. You know, I'd like this town to be where young families could move in. It would not be such a big deal, where senior citizens wouldn't have to leave town when they sell their house. You know, or that our school could have enough people in it. So that in the sewer, you know, our whole sewer study, that's gonna come crashing on us. Here we are being all, put the ducks in a row. Let's get our plan. And that sewer thing is just gonna land on us like a ton of bricks. So,
Yes, we call that a forthcoming agenda item, Mary. But yes, go ahead.
oh, it's really gonna be forthcoming, but yes.
Yes, go ahead, Marcia.
Well, I agree with Mary, even though I'm guilty and I'm retired. But I have to say that, you know, you don't do things well if you try and do too many things. But having said that, I'm a little concerned that we've got all these different committees and they're out there doing things. And they're not independent actors that are supposed to be just, you know, running their own separate show. It's supposed to be in furtherance of a town goal articulated by the town and sort of overseen by the legislative body. And so I think that to that extent, we should find some bandwidth to make sure that whatever we're doing, if we're sort of focusing on Article 36, the Child Care Committee, policing, that's keeping the lights running, okay, in that context, let's just have a look, take the temperature of what these different committees are doing and make sure that they're not getting, you know, the cart before the horse. Because as Mary said, we don't have $20–40 million to put in a sewer system. So if we get that cart out there, then, you know, we have no horse. And we also don't want to be in a situation where we're asking for things, grants and stuff that we get, and then we can't do anything with them because we're not poised. I'm also concerned about these, what I think are potentially mushrooming separate sites. I think the presence of websites is important. And if, you know, just to use the Energy Committee for an example, they've got a .com and a .org on their site, and they're advertising, these are our solar companies. I don't know who gave them permission to say that we have solar companies. Is that exclusive? Is there a list? Are we liable if some of those companies have a contractual problem with a person in Norwich who relied upon the fact that this is our solar company? I really have problems about our liability and knowing what's going on with the committees that we've empowered to do stuff. So I do think we have to find the bandwidth to just monitor that.
Okay, do other folks share Marcia's interest in oversight or monitoring, or I'll say engagement with, that sounds nice, engagement with our committees? Claudette has her hand up, and then Mary.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you're gonna have to help me with taking my hand down.
Okay.
Oh, there it is. Okay. I agree with what Marcia has been saying, and I think it's been on our radar, Roger, even last year with this proliferation of websites that are not, that
Sanctioned.
don't seem to be in compliance with our social media policy. And so one thing that we tried to do a couple years ago was have quarterly reports from committees, and that's clearly has failed. Some have been very good, but some have not. And I think it's time that we probably invite the chairs of each committee to the board to present before the board and have them give us a presentation. What are your goals, and see if they align with ours.
Right. So Claudette just mentioned one way to reach out and engage or re-engage, which is convening, right? Ask folks to convene. Any other ideas that people have for how to engage? Go ahead, Claudette.
Can I add, I just want to add one more thing to that. And this is one thing that Pam has raised in the past, and that's having all committees use the same format for agendas.
Yeah.
And having, whether or not it's training or whatever, in what's involved as the committee chair. So there are certain provisions of the open meeting law that they have to follow. And there's information that should be included. Some committees are good about including packets with their agendas, others aren't. It's all of that kind of rolled into one that I think we need to work with our chairs more.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments on committees? Go ahead, Robert, or Robert.
It would probably be worthwhile if during these, if we're going to require these periodic reports from the committees, making sure that one of the through lines is that they be asked how well they're aligning their work with what their charge was.
Yeah, an audit.
Yeah, explicitly looking at it again and saying, are you doing this work, or do you really feel that that charge needs to be amended to accommodate the things that you think are necessary?
Right. Any other ideas or any other comments? Go ahead, Marcia.
Well, I think it's an opportunity each year when we're doing the operational plan or whatever the through lines, we should maybe give directives. I mean, I'm not afraid of giving directives to say, okay, we've got this Article 36 and we see that these committees play into that. So, give us some ideas about how you can facilitate that particular initiative of the board in the town.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me too, as part of like sort of pre-appointment process too, right? Because when people go to be appointed, they should sort of know what they might be expected to do in the next year or so. That's like a good process. But I think even going back further, I'm thinking maybe I'm too fixated on process, but I go to every meeting is always different, right? Like I come into a meeting like, what are their rules for the conduct of meetings. Like, you know, do they agree to take, like, how are their agendas formed, right? Like how are decisions made? You know, sort of everything that's outlined in our rules of procedure. Like I make the agenda with the town manager, but people can add their own agenda items, right? Like I can be overruled in the course of a meeting, right? All of these things are in our policy for the conduct for regular meetings. And I think some committees more than others might benefit from having that kind of policy, or we write the policy that applies to their committee meeting. Go ahead, Mary.
I think it could be a little looser. I mean, we do have the open meeting law, and it is perplexing, even those who've been working with it for a while, but that's a law and we have to deal with that. And also I think that Marcia may have a point that if there's behavior, even if it's unwitting, that might lead the town to be liable about something, then you're also moving over into the legal realm. So there's the legal aspect, and then there's sort of the effectiveness aspect. There's a transparency, you want to know what's going on. And also are these committees being effective? And sometimes if it's a committee with interpersonal conflict, they could, I think, benefit from a little more formality. So to me, it's the legal, it's the transparency, and it's the effectiveness. But I wouldn't want to just say that everybody has to do everything exactly the same way. I still think there's a little wiggle room for either the type of material being discussed or the personalities in the room. And there is, I think, a kind of an impressive level of volunteer effort, which I kind of admire about this town. And there's kind of a spirit that at least the more functional committees kind of have. They have a kind of dedication to what they're doing. So I don't want to damp that down too much.
Yes, yeah. Herb, I'll get to your question, Miranda, but I want to bring in Herb and Miranda a little bit on this, because I know that Herb and Miranda in the town manager's office does an extensive amount of work to support our committees. And I guess my question is, is there enough staff support, or is there enough staff support, or how much staff time is taken up broadly to support the work of committees?
Well,
Is that a hard question? Is that a body politic question?
I want to start with the simple and basically say, in general, there's enough staff support to do the postings and all that sort of stuff that we need in general. You know, Miranda, that's the responsibility through the town manager's office. Where we don't have the staff capacity is, for instance, this past Saturday, when a certain committee delivered the agenda to Miranda's office with the instructions to post it for a meeting on Monday. You can't expect my staff to be doing stuff on a Saturday or to be reviewing email on a Saturday for a meeting on a Monday, and to expect open meeting law to be adhered to as well. So that particular committee couldn't meet on this past Monday. So the courtesy is really the root of what has to occur. Have we made some mistakes before where there's been a committee that's religiously good about giving us enough notice to do stuff and we periodically forget because it's so far in advance? Yes, that's happened before. But for the most part, it's the coordination that, and this gets back to what Claudette mentioned with regard to education of chairs. I think this is a good point, is to say, you can't just assume that because you're comfortable as a board, you have your agenda and your packet, that then everything is kosher to move forward. There has to be the appreciation that there may be some staff aspect of it in terms of getting things posted from that standpoint. And I think that's just an educational process with a chair or a responsible person on the particular committees. In terms of, you know, for relevant, certain committees have an actual staff person assigned to them, like town manager for the select board, Rod for the DRB and the planning commission, and probably affordable housing committee as well. but there are some committees that operate independently. Solid Waste Committee, Finance Committee, Conservation Commission,
Energy.
the subcommittee of trails for the Conservation Commission. There are staff, at least during the Zoom timeframe, I have a staff person that's assigned to everybody that we try to at least monitor stuff, but they're not really staff people like we are to you, or like Miranda and I are to you folks, or that Rod is to, say, the Planning Commission. So there are, so the only thing there is that for those other committees that are more independent of things, that again, that educational aspect is important, because there has been a lot of staff interaction in certain instances when open meeting law isn't adhered to, or they take more leeway to what they can or cannot do beyond what Mary's perspective is, that, you know, you got to let the zealous people do the zealous things, but they have to do it within certain parameters of the open meeting law and other general codes of conduct for meetings, and same thing with the web page type stuff. So I think in general we can do it. The question is, are you guys going to evolve with committees where you are going to have a level of expectation of a staff person to go toward that? If you're going in that direction, absolutely not. Do I have staff to do that?
Okay, go ahead, Marcia.
I was just thinking as Herb and everybody was talking, maybe what we need is something like a committee policy book that includes templates for agendas and minutes that they could use, and directives that we give to the chair every year. This is what the board is working on this year, and the directives we see that we'd like you to help with are these. And then maybe a questionnaire that we get from them that's, you know, how do you see possible initiatives that will help in the work that we're doing as a whole town. So basically give them some tools and require some feedback in addition to the reports that we have.
Right. Mary, you have a thought on that? And then Herb.
It's sort of a balance to me of what comes down from the top and what comes up from the bottom. So I don't think we've ever given a directive to the Conservation Commission, for instance, or the Historic Preservation Commission. I mean, they kind of have, again, it's a little bit of concentration of expertise and interest there. So there's some kind of balance between us directing them and us even being informed about, well, what are their broad considerations? What are their intersections of knowledge with what we have to know?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of I think what I'm hearing is there's a little bit of more consistency that we would like to expect in terms of procedures for conducting meetings and agenda setting, and some more training opportunities for both of those. But I think there's also where I'm hearing an opportunity for more meaningful engagement. Like, why are we having a scoping grant for sidewalks without a planning commission weighing in on it formally, right? Like, I think sidewalks are a big part of planning, right? I think similarly, a major energy capital project was put forward by a committee, right? And with lukewarm or unclear support from the board, right? So I think like all of that is on us to like engage more meaningfully, so we can like not sort of control, but to engage, right? Because I think we're all feeling overwhelmed after this meeting, and we need our committees to like support the work of this town, right? So go ahead, Marcia.
Well, I was just going to say, Mary's right. You can't direct everybody on every little thing, nor would we want to, but we do want to make sure that people aren't going rogue. And we also want to make sure that opportunities aren't missed. So the Conservation Commission might be able to come up with some good ideas for, you know, areas that the child care folks, you know, if something comes to fruition, they could do something, you know, with them. I don't know. But the other thing that I think is important is that the website, our website, be the one that everybody uses, and that we, as soon as possible, help them get pages on our website. And we, like Dartmouth has specific format for how the web pages go together. And every department is different, obviously, but there's a format. And I think we can easily do that with the town. But I'm very worried about what we're presenting as town recommendations and making sure that we get our hands around that before we do have a liability issue.
Okay, Herb has his hand up, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit more, but I want to wrap this part of it up. Go ahead, Herb.
If there is high level expectation of web page and the staff maintaining that, I mean, clearly that's a function of having to figure out administrative rights to that and how to use WordPress. I totally agree with Marcia, and I think it was Claudette that said we need to clamp down on that. I agree, but I can tell you I don't have staff to maintain that website.
Right.
I just don't. The other piece of that is the handbook. I really love the handbook thing. If you expect staff to do that, I don't have the time to do that. But I think that there are basic tenets to that, like Claudette mentioned, the standard for what should be the general format of the agenda, that the basics of the basic handout of what is the open meeting law and the rules with regard to that. So I think that there are basic things that could be put together, at least in the interim. And I think that was, Claudette can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was one of sort of the strategic goals of the board a couple of years ago, was to have something like that. And then it would sort of go through the annual update or sign off on or something shortly after the reorganizational meeting of the board. There's something along those lines. And then just specific to committees, remember that some committees have statutory obligations, like the Planning Commission, the DRB, even the Conservation Commission. The Conservation Commission is as established by statute. It's not the lesser that you can deal with, which is a committee. So they actually have statutory obligation. I'm not saying you can't ask them to do things or charge them with doing things, but they do themselves have statutory obligations and responsibilities compared to some of your other committees, childcare, solid waste, finance. I'm drawing a blank on what might be some of the others, so that there's just a little bit of a differentiation between and among some of the committees that you appoint people to.
And the charges are different. Like childcare and Article 36 are ad hoc, right? They have. I mean, Article 36 says that you'll disband when the climate crisis is solved, basically. But they both require renewal from us, right? Which is a little different. Like they're not standing. So this is what I would like to do, just to try to put a bow on this. I think we should begin to convene some committees, not all at once, but slowly over before the end of the summer, maybe, and ask them questions about what is it they're working on, and to help them prepare for that meeting. I'll ask them the question that Rob put out, their charge, and in ways that they support their charge, or in ways that they've go beyond the scope of their charge, for good reason, in ways in which they exceed and excel, let's say, beyond their charge. And that'll be and we'll have a little bit of a conversation with them. I think I think we need to revise the social media policy, but I think Herb and Miranda have alluded to wider structural website issues that might be a capital campaign thing. So, and then everything else, this handbook and what it might contain. I'm wondering, Claudette, if you might consider helping us think through some of that and maybe put it forth in a memo. Don't write it necessarily, but put forth some of the chapters and put that forward as a first. And maybe
I was actually going to volunteer to do such a thing.
Okay. And would you like a second? Would you like to send it to a second person before bringing it back to the full board? Or would you just like to go forth and
I'll just go forth and do it and bring it to the board, and I hope to get that by the first meeting in June.
Okay.
Is that too late?
No, I appreciate people's dates because I need to think for our meeting next week. I'm gonna type everything up. So yeah, that's good. I think that's fine. Do others agree? Okay, go ahead, Mary.
I do agree. I think it could be just very interesting for the public. If you had, I don't know if it'd be really possible to do a lot of them at once. It would almost be also almost a showcase of what's going on in town. I mean, it could be an event kind of thing.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. No,
Thanks.
yes. And I think that's the spirit in which we want to proceed, right? Because I think committees are very much, when we're interested in something that they're working on, they're as excited as much as they're, terrified by the attention. So that's, okay. So, and I think Claudette, when she brings her memo will see how it intersects with some of the concerns or issues that Herb and Miranda have alluded to in terms of the support. They're not, I'm saying concerns or issues, they're not quite that, but what word would you like to use? Not issues. The governance of that. Okay. Any other goals that people want to talk about in the next 15 minutes that we want to talk about, or anyone want to talk about their SWOT analysis?
I think it's going to be helpful to see what you guys had discussed previously. I think that will really help clarify for me what I may subsequently identify as a goal.
Yeah. Don't get too excited, but yes,
Oh, no.
we did have a plan forward. Yeah.
Claudette, well, I think we solved all the problems of the town in the first 45 minutes. So, but it's time to revise those plans already. So I guess we're back square.
I remember that way, Rob.
Yeah.
There's three big policies that we really should take on, or maybe just two. The personnel policies are a must, right? I think they were on a goal from 2017. So let's do it, people. And then the animal control ordinance, I really want to do this, but I feel like if people are not talking about policing on the listserv, they're talking about dogs. So we should probably maybe do some animal control ordinance work. And that's a huge undertaking. Huge. Herb is like looking up at me with one eye. So yes, he agrees.
It's emotional.
Yes. Well, yes. Okay, and then the other big one that's not on here is the solar tax stabilization. We have to talk. We'll have to take action on that. But
And this is after we've completed our master financial policy edits, right?
Yeah, so I see there's three big policies I had wanted to start in July, but I think we're probably looking at the time between then and budget season. So maybe August-y, September-y to start to look at them, and then
To start to look at those three big ordinances, you're saying?
Right. Yep.
We're gonna get, I hope we don't look and then get swept away by the budget.
Claudia has her hand up. Let's see what she thinks.
Herb had sent out the red line. A big part of the personnel policy was pertained to the union contract and the union negotiations. And then Herb, you subsequently sent out this big red line document that addressed a big chunk of the personnel policy. So I'm not sure that it's going to be as complicated as we think it may be. It may still be. I think there are some outstanding issues, like from discussion a few years ago, whether or not to include the fire department in that, and that's my thoughts on that, if some have changed from what they were, and so, but a lot of it is union contracting related, so, and that's all been done, and Herb sent the red line with all those changes to us.
Yeah, we need to interface what we adopted in the union contract backward into the personnel policy red line that's out there to ensure evenness, equity is the word. I think that in other words, I think that what's in the union contract, some of that needs to be discussed by you folks as to whether you want the personnel policy for what I'll call exempt employees to have that same set of inclusive, benefit, leave, all those sorts of little things, or not.
Yeah, and
It's a little bit different doing it for exempt employees because you don't have the threat of unfair labor practice if it doesn't look exactly the same. But if you, for instance, gave non-union employees, say, 6 weeks of vacation every year, no matter what, the union contract, you have to earn your way toward a certain number of weeks of vacation. If that was the case, you would get an unfair labor practice faster than anything else. But so it's that sort of blending that you've got to do to ensure continuity, equity, and so there's some of that discussion that you folks have to have. So yes.
and Roger, I still have the original work, so I'd be happy to start to chip away at the personnel policy.
That'd be great, at least to get it so we can more clearly see the sort of the status, and so we could make a plan forward.
And hopefully by July. How's
Yeah.
that?
Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking August, but that's okay. But July is even better. Go ahead, Mary.
I'm thinking I would offer to be a second on the animal ordinance. The animal issues interest me.
Yeah, and I think it relates a little bit to some of the policing conversations we're going to have, which is not to put two major issues together, but I think it intersects in a way where we've done carefully, if talked about carefully, it would be good or productive. And I think I think the animal control ordinance, you could maybe start the work, but you don't have to complete it. But I think we need to be committed to making some progress.
Doing something about it. Yeah. Yep.
Any other policy work that people had in mind? The tax stabilization, Marcia wrote to me and had some questions, and we'll move forward with discussing some of them. I don't see a rush on this. Certainly not until the summer.
Roger.
Yes.
So on the animal control, if you could include Simon and Bree as some staff liaison, because those are the two departments that get affected the most by animal control issues.
Yes, and I think part of it, we'll have to define some stakeholders too, like the town pound and
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Marcia.
So as to the solar tax, I'm doing a lot of work on that already, just research and. So
That's good.
No, but-
Okay, good. Okay, and then maybe, and I'm sure you'll you'll send something, and that'll help with scheduling that out, or inform it. Okay, so I think that's more than enough, people. No more goals, unless I misrepresented or didn't. What have I, Rob? What have I missed?
Very comprehensive overview.
Okay. So there's nothing, I know that you had emailed us out. It didn't make the packet, it'll make a next packet, but is there something that you wanted to mention about goals that we hadn't addressed?
No, I think the content that everybody else presented was put together is pretty comprehensive.
Okay. Go ahead, Marcia.
The only thing I'm concerned about is the website.
I was gonna say.
So I think I have some ideas. Maybe I'll just bounce off you first, Roger, but
I think so. That would be helpful because I think some of it is social media policy and then some of it is like structural infrastructure issues. And so it would, to the extent that it'll help me form an agenda around it, that would be good because maybe it's just policy conversation, maybe it's a capital budgeting conversation. I just don't
Or
know
both.
that. So maybe both. And,
It'd be
and
good to keep that in the loop.
yeah, and I could talk
Check
to
everything else.
And Herb has been responding this week to the first step of IT stuff. So, so that is related. We'll hear about it next week, I think. Okay, it's now 8:54. We're 50 minutes behind. So I would like to move us forward. Is that okay?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is this MOU for the I don't want to say the finance committee. Cheryl had specific language and I want to make sure I honor that. The Norwich Finance Committee, the reauthorization MOU for the Norwich Finance Committee with the Norwich School Board. This was just the last MOU was just a yearly adoption. We can talk about it now a little bit, or we could just decide that we'll talk about this when we get some finance committee applicants. How is it that people want to talk about this MOU? Go ahead, Marcia.
can you explain? I don't think we have a finance committee. Is that true?
We have one member.
We don't
Currently.
have a quorum.
We don't have a quorum.
Okay. And so this is the Dresden Finance Committee, not the Norwich Finance Committee.
So yes. So this is a memorandum of understanding between the school board and the school board and our board regarding the Norwich and Dresden finance committees, right? Because when they combine, they're the Dresden committee.
But it does say in Article 1 that the Norwich Finance Committee shall have a charge. And I have a problem that we don't have a committee.
Right.
Well, they have a charge. We just don't have the committee. It's sort of the chicken and the egg. Do you want the structure in place in case some people step up to be in the committee or not? And personally, I don't care one way or the other. I think without a committee, it's kind of a dead horse.
I don't see how we could sign this if we didn't have a committee, because it implies we do have a committee and we will give them a charge.
Right. But I mean, I think it also talks, right. I think what it is that when we will have the committee, then this chart, like this MOU applies to it. But I think I hear what you're saying, it doesn't say that, right? So
If we send it, it says when we have a Norwich Finance Committee, they will have a charge, but we don't have one at the moment. Or we have now and then we're all set.
I mean,
Move the table. And then without a date certain.
would we like to do that?
I'd like to see a finance committee.
If we table it, it does have to be to a date certain, doesn't it, Herb?
No.
No? Well, I think we should just table it then.
Is there a motion?
Oh, let's see.
I don't know.
I move to table the decision to ratify the memorandum of understanding between the Norwich Select Board and Norwich School Board regarding the Norwich and Dresden Finance Committee, which is included in this meeting packet. To table until we have a quorum of the Finance Committee.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Discussion? Go ahead, Marcia.
Shouldn't we be appointing a Norwich Finance Committee? I mean, we don't even have a committee to have a quorum of.
Yeah, and so at our next agenda, I'll have a list of all the vacancies from all of our committees, and we could discuss how we want to, do further outreach. But I think the process that we affirmed in our organizational meeting, where the dates and how they were advertised, has been completed, and so now, now we can decide a future process for whatever is vacant, or they can remain vacant. I think there's a difference between having 2 seats open on a solid waste committee versus not having, versus having multiple seats, not having a quorum, right?
So it seems to me like this is important and we should maybe expedite this.
Well, you mean to get some people on the finance committee? Like to find some people is what you're saying?
Yes, and then ratify this memorandum of understanding.
Right.
So we can make
Maybe-
it, go ahead.
Maybe there's not a lot of enthusiasm for it. We did have some people who served on it and felt that they weren't making a difference, and then they decided to resign. So I don't know if there's an ick factor for this committee. I don't know if in that case, and also, someone might move to town who really would love to do it, or something might change. But we're not going to know. You could do outreach, but it may also just kind of be a matter of luck or things that change.
So let's, we can just let me, as I said, we can make it a future, I can put the vacancies of our committees and we can go forward with that. I mean, I, for example, am now the health officer, right? And so that is also inherently an interim situation. So yeah, go ahead, Marcia.
What's the harm of not signing this immediately?
There isn't.
Tabling it,
So the motion was to table it, but it was brought forward. It was brought forward because the MOU calls for a yearly ratification. And so if we decide to table it, I'll just simply go update our counterparts with what we're doing, and then, we'll go from there.
Okay.
Any other discussion? Sorry, I sounded like that was what we're going to do, and I didn't mean to. That's what we could do.
We needed a second, right? Did somebody second Mary's motion?
Seconded it,
Yeah,
Rob
it's
did,
just
yeah.
a motion to table it until we have enough people to do something with it.
Okay,
That's all it is.
let's call the question. We'll roll call it because I don't see Claudette's face, which is fine. So Mary, how do you vote?
I vote yes.
Marcia?
Yes.
Rob?
yes.
Claudette?
Yes.
And I'm yes. And some of the points in the discussion are well taken. Okay, so it's now an hour over, and thank you everyone for that. Oh no, wait, we have to, our last, go ahead.
Agenda, right?
Yes. So I think there's 2 policies that could potentially be brought forward: the undesignated fund policy, and I think Claudette and I could do a quick, based on how we've worked in the past, I think we can quickly turn around a draft of a gift policy. But anything else?
I don't feel like I am ready with the debt management. I haven't worked with Marcia on it yet. I've been doing some research, but I won't be ready for next Wednesday.
Okay. Go ahead, Herb.
There'll be a request to apply for that annual Vermont League of Cities and Towns equipment safety grant that we annually go for. You'll also have a request to move forward with the low bid on the fit up of the new truck that you will authorize to pay for at your last meeting. So it'll be another request to authorize spending out of the designated fund for the fit up. The bids actually were opened up the day of the last meeting. You did talk about policing earlier this meeting as an agenda item. And sorry, I'm just going through my folder to see if there's anything else here that you had. I think that's it, at least from what I have in my hands right now.
Okay, and then Herb, some of the policies that were slated for May 26th, I think you've been, are they able to be brought forward for our discussion, like the credit card policy, or not yet?
I will, I'm not ready yet, but there's some of them that I definitely have drafted. I just need, with Seth's help, I just need to go through and deal with that. Sorry, this week has been a headache because the IT proposals are due on Friday. So I've had a bunch of proposers ask questions. So I've been spending my whole time answering questions besides police questions.
Yes, that's fine. Okay, so we have these two policies. We'll discuss those two policies. And then, or potential, like I'm assuming that Claudette and I can work quickly. We might not be able to. Anything, and then do we want to talk about, so for the policing, the policing stuff, the policing agenda item, I'm operating under the assumption that the motion that we made is still a motion that we made, and was going to work with Herb on sort of figuring out what we need to do to begin the process for community conversations, and also what we want to do to convene to further understand the issues. And it would be ultimately a 6-month plan, because that was my understanding of Herb's proposal, that the board has 6 months to have a process. So that's how I was going to frame the agenda item. Should I be framing the agenda item differently? Go ahead, Mary.
I think there may be people in town who don't pay as much attention, who are suddenly wondering why we're delaying hiring a police chief. I think the conversational aspect is hugely valuable. I think that it could be done, in my mind, with the input of a new police chief. Like, I don't see them as sort of dependent on each other. To me, it's going a little too far in that direction. So, if there was a motion to reconsider, I made that motion on the last meeting because I really wanted to know where everyone stood. And it seems to me that maybe Marcia and I feel more strongly about this police chief issue than the others do. However, have we heard from enough people? I know we've heard from people that really do want to delay this. That's come out loud and clear. And I think there are people who really are quite concerned about it. So it's one of those kind of difficult situations. It's almost split down the middle. I had thought we'd settled it, but I'm not so sure now. I'd like to hear what Marcia has to say, actually.
Well, I feel that it's been a little convoluted, that people think that this is about a police chief. And I think it's about a person, and that the law basically says if you've got one person who's in the police, he's going to be the chief, because you have to have a chief. So I think that's a red herring when people are talking about having a chief. I think the issue is having enough coverage so that the things that happen to, like, Deb Hannum don't happen to anybody else. And I think we can get our hands around the other things that are offensive or people perceive to be racist or whatever. But we've got two competing kinds of issues. One is a person who has had her house violated and lost things, and we don't even have the bandwidth as a police organization to help her get those things traced or find the perpetrators. And I think that's a failing of this community. We should, and I'm also absolutely distraught when I think about, I heard Jennifer Frank was sleeping under her desk sometimes to keep enough coverage in the town. I think we can do better for our police people rather than have them doing things like that. So I think the real issue is adequate coverage so that we don't have more break-ins. And to my mind, 1 a year is too much. And I think we've had more than 1 a year. So I'd really like to reconsider it because I don't really understand how we went from, I can't remember the dates, whether it was the 14th of April, when I thought we were going to proceed and then proceed with the hiring of a new police chief so that we had enough people, and then simultaneously begin the discussion in the community about what we wanted our police force to look like. Suddenly that changed on the 28th, and we were going in a direction where we were not hiring an extra body. We were actually going to have a reduced force, I believe, for 6 months. And I can understand why people are upset about that. I think that's a failure of protection on our part. And I don't see that continuing with the status quo that we had is putting other people in danger. Rather, we are putting people in danger potentially by having fewer people right now.
So Claudia had her hand up, and then I'll share what's happening in the community right next door to us, who also has an interim chief, who is also looking at policing issues over a dedicated period of time, who also then plans on running a national search. Because for me, Norwich is not exceptional in its policing in any way, one way or another. We are unique in particular. And so I understand what both of you are saying relates to our unique and particular situation. But I would also say that a 6-month period has an express intentionality, but is no different than what is happening next door, right? So I think the information and discourse and ideology is just tripping up what should just be a process. But Claudette, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and my, I mean, I could refute a lot of what's said, but I don't want to rehash this issue. I think we need to go forward with the process that we had agreed to or voted on, that the majority of the board voted to approve at our last meeting. The end result, which may or may not change what
Right.
the past configuration of the police department is. We don't know that, but I think we need to go through the process of convening members of the public, getting the data on the calls, and moving forward from there. We're 251 communities, gorges, villages, whatever in the state of Vermont, and less than 50 have a police department. You can't tell me that every town that does not have a police department is awash with crime. I don't believe that. And we have a police department, but I'm not gonna.
And we also will have an interim chief. So I think, so the way that I'm framing this agenda item is a plan for a process forward, and then an update from Herb on what he had outlined in his memo to us and that we affirmed, which there was a second motion that was made, if you remember, which was 4-1, right? Mary then supported.
Yeah, I did.
So,
Because, I thought we were taking a direction on the last.
Mhm.
And I was arguing against that direction and not wanting to undermine what we're trying to do. But also, I do feel the concern of people who may not have had this on their radar and who don't feel safe. But perhaps that is just the minority view. So we'll have to live with that. That's all. And it's like that sometimes.
so at this
Minority
point,
view.
at this point, because we're discussing future agenda items, we're not discussing policing, right? I want to say, is there disagreement on the framing of the agenda item?
No, not by me.
The frame, you'll have to remind me, what is it framed as?
So a preliminary process for a way forward um, that Herb and I, to the extent possible in the time that we have, will, before the packet deadline, will outline, and then an update from Herb on the movement forward on what he described in his memo, right? So in other words, is the interim solution worked out with the union? Is it finalized? So if there's a disagreement on that, and there'll be some kind of memo in the packet, that's what I would like to know right now. Claudette is saying there's no disagreement from her. Mary?
I don't like it, but I think it's the right thing to do. It's the direction that we decided to do last time. So
Yeah. Thank you. I respect
reluctantly,
that.
yes.
Okay, Marcia?
Well, I just don't see the harm of hiring another person and then going through the process of analysis. And I think to the extent that we could do that, we would assure the other people in town, like Debbie Hannon, that they're not going to be at risk because of lack of one more person. Maybe they're not, but I think it's important. And if you put it to a vote in town, I kind of think it would lean towards having another person and just keeping the status quo while we examined the situation, because in terms of liability, that seems to me less liability for us. We haven't changed anything without blessing of the people.
It's not changing any of the structure. It's calling for an interim solution for 6 months.
True, but we're without one person. If you can tell me that we're going to have the same number of people, I'm okay with it.
Herb outlined in his memo his plan for filling that coverage, and he stressed that it was not something that was sustainable for us or for any other neighboring community for more than the 6-month period that he outlined. He said that it was a year, but he said that he would like to begin another search after 6 months of a process. That's what the memo said, and that is what we affirmed.
Right, and I was worried because when he was talking about it, he said, and sorry, Herb, I'm not putting words in your mouth here. I'm just trying to recap what I heard, which was that it's hard to assure that you'll be able to get the people even if you want to. And that's what I'm worried about.
So would you like an update on that and more complexity of that as part of the agenda item?
Yes.
Okay, so you support that. You support the agenda item with that addition.
I support having the same number of bodies policing this town.
Yes, and if I felt that there was enough support on this board for that, that's exactly my position too.
And that's not the agenda item.
It's not it.
So Rob, is that do you support the agenda item as I have described?
Yes.
Okay, so respectfully,
That's last time.
that's consensus. So you can make, so there's nothing that would preclude either of you from making your motion, but I outlined how I'm going to frame the agenda item. And look, I feel just as vulnerable about this decision as everyone does, right? So like the packet submission is going to be scrutinized, and we will all handle that together.
Okay.
Yeah, Mary's
Well,
like being a let me. Okay.
That's all right. That's all
Okay.
right. We've decided it feels uncomfortable to me, but it's just like that when we're not unanimous. It feels better to be unanimous.
Remember
So this
the
is the
days,
case we're not.
just think about the days where we weren't unanimous, and then you all.
I've been through a lot of that, so that's fine.
Okay.
We're a healthy democracy.
Yes.
What is it?
We are a healthy democracy.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
that is true.
At 9:18, over an hour after my agenda. So any other agenda items? So we have some policies. We have the two purchases, the two equipment safety grant and the fit up of the new truck to consider. And then the sort of follow up to the preliminary policing plan. And I feel like that's enough. Does anyone have any
That's
other
enough.
items? Okay. Great. Whew. Well, I appreciate everyone. And if everyone didn't feel heard in this conversation, are there any lingering thoughts? Please write to me, and we'll figure that out. Go ahead, Rob.
I'd like to make a motion
Yes.
to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second,
Okay. I think we have to roll call. Roll call. Mary, how do you vote?
I vote yes.
Marcia? Rob?
Yeah.
Claudette?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Thank you all.
Thank
All
you.
right, bye. Take care.
bye-bye.